Princess Sulara stood in the grand library of her palace, the soft glow of alien violites casting shadows on the marble floors. The Vari dominion had prospered for centuries, its people advanced in technology and culture, and yet they had always been a peaceful civilization. War was something they avoided at all costs. Sulara, the youngest of the ruling family, had been taught that violence and conflict were nothing but relics of a forgotten past. Her world was one of diplomacy, art, and intellect. But among the vast collection of ancient texts and scrolls, there were whispers of something darker, something that haunted the distant corners of the galaxy. The stories were old, often dismissed by scholars as myths or exaggerations. They spoke of the Terrans, a race of humans whose warriors were said to be unmatched in strength and will. Legends told of these warriors, brave, relentless fighters who had once roamed the stars, conquering enemies with terrifying precision. Their resolve was legendary, said to never waver, no matter the odds. The tales spoke of battles where the Terrans stood firm against overwhelming forces, even when outnumbered by hundreds to one. It was said they fought not for riches or power, but for something far deeper: honor, freedom, and the will to protect those they loved. To Sulara, however, these were just stories. In the advanced, peaceful world of the Vari, such tales seemed like nothing more than the stuff of fables, ancient songs sung to scare children. But as she flipped through the brittle pages of an ancient manuscript, a chilling unease began to settle in her chest. The Terrans weren't just a myth, were they? There was something unsettling about the way the stories described their warriors. Not just their power, but their resilience, their refusal to bow down, even in the face of certain death. Sulara had heard similar stories growing up, but it was easy to dismiss them as the fantasies of people who had lived in a different age. The Vari had long since moved beyond such barbaric ways. Yet there was a nagging feeling in her mind, a strange instinct telling her that maybe, just maybe, there was truth to those old legends. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden tremor, followed by a loud crash echoing through the palace halls. Sulara's heart raced as her personal guards rushed to her side. She could hear the distant sounds of alarms blaring, signaling an intrusion. The Vari had long been insulated from outside threats, but something was different now. Sulara's eyes narrowed as she quickly left the library, making her way toward the observation deck. She could see the distant outline of an enemy fleet emerging from the shadows of the system. It was large, too large for a simple raid. A fleet of Dravak warships, known for their brutal conquests, had arrived in Vari space. The Dravak were a ruthless species, known for conquering entire star systems, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Sulara's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the enemy vessels drawing closer. Her first instinct was to retreat, to call for a peace envoy, but deep down, she knew that the peaceful ways of the Vari could not save them now. The stories of the Terrans, of their warriors, flashed in her mind. Could the legends be true? Was there truly a force out there capable of standing against the Dravak? As the fleet continued to close in, Sulara realized something terrifying. She might soon find out if those myths were more than just stories. With the Vari fleet already scrambling to mount a defense, Princess Sulara understood that her people had never faced an enemy like the Dravak. She could feel it in her bones. A storm was coming, and it was going to change everything. Princess Sulara stood at the helm of her personal shuttle, watching in shock as the Vari fleet struggled to form a defensive line against the incoming Dravak warships. The alarms blared, and the lights flickered as the power systems fluctuated under the intense pressure. The smooth, glass-like surface of her palace now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the cold, metallic walls of the ship. Her heart raced with the grim realization that her people, those who had never known true conflict, were about to face a nightmare unlike anything they had ever imagined. She had never expected to find herself in the middle of a war, let alone be the one responsible for its defense. Despite her royal bloodline and elite training, Sulara had never been prepared for this. As a child, she had learned about diplomacy and peace, But nothing had prepared her for the violent fury of the Dravik, a species known for their ruthlessness. Her mind raced with questions, but one stood out above all. How could her people survive this? Their ships were fast and sleek, designed for exploration, not battle. Their weapons were designed for defense, not offense. And the Dravik, well, they were built for conquest. In a desperate move, Silara's fleet attempted to flee toward a nearby moon, hoping to hide within its shadow. But the Dravik were relentless. Their ships were much larger, heavily armed, and far more advanced in combat. The Vari ships were slowly picked off, one by one, like prey caught in the jaws of a hungry predator. Silara could feel the panic spreading throughout her fleet as communications were cut off, and the crew scrambled to respond to damage reports. She knew there was no way her people could win this battle, not with their limited resources and lack of experience in real combat. But as the situation grew darker, Silara refused to give in to despair. She had to think. She had to act. "Your Highness," her captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking through her racing thoughts. "The enemy is closing in. We can't outrun them. We need a plan. Now." Silara's fingers tightened on the armrest of her chair, her mind flashing through every option, every possible move. Her eyes darted over the chaotic scene unfolding before her. And then something strange caught her attention. A flicker in the distance. Something, or someone, was moving with incredible speed, darting between the attacking Dravik ships. It wasn't a Vari vessel. It was a human ship. Impossible. She had heard the stories, the myths of the Terran warriors, but they were just that. Stories. Were they true? Before she could process what she had seen, the shuttle rocked violently as it was struck by enemy fire. The impact sent a jolt through her body, and alarms began blaring in every corner of the ship. "We're losing power," the captain shouted, his voice laced with fear. "We need to get out of here." But Silara knew there was no escape. The shuttle was damaged, and the Dravik had them cornered. As the Vari forces were falling apart, Silara's thoughts flashed back to the ancient texts she had read. The tales of the Terran warriors, their strength, their relentless courage, suddenly felt less like myths and more like a lifeline. Maybe, just maybe, there was something out there, someone who could save them. But who? And where were they? Then, just as it seemed all hope was lost, the unexpected happened. A figure appeared before her, stepping onto the shuttle with an air of quiet command. The door slid open, and Silara's eyes widened in disbelief. Standing before her was a human, a real, living human. His presence radiated something she couldn't quite place. Confidence, strength. But most of all, he had a look in his eyes that told her he was not afraid. He was here to fight. His name was Dante Voss, a warrior unlike any she had ever seen. And in that moment, Silara realized that the stories of old were not just stories. The Terrans were real, and one had come to save her. The sudden appearance of Dante Voss was like a flash of lightning in the dark storm that was rapidly consuming the Vari fleet. Silara couldn't take her eyes off him as he stood tall in the shuttle's entrance. He was dressed in a suit of battle-worn armor that seemed far too ancient for the sleek, polished corridors of her ship. His helmet, black with scratches from countless battles, was tucked under his arm, revealing a rugged face with sharp, hard features. His dark eyes were filled with a quiet intensity, one that spoke of countless battles fought and survived. He didn't seem like someone who had ever known fear. To Silara, he looked less like a soldier and more like a force of nature. She blinked, still trying to process what was happening. This human, Dante Voss, had just appeared from nowhere, cutting through the chaos with an ease that didn't seem possible. The Dravik were closing in, but he acted as if nothing was wrong. He wasn't rushing, wasn't panicking. His every movement seemed calm, controlled, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. "Get the princess to safety," one of the crew members stammered, but Dante barely spared them a glance. Instead, his gaze locked on Silara. his expression unreadable, as if he had already assessed everything in the room in an instant. "You're in charge now," Dant said simply. His voice was deep, with a slight gravel that gave it weight. "Get everyone to the escape pods. I'll handle the Dravek." Silara opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She had never been in a situation like this, never had to make decisions under such pressure. Her people had never known war. They had never been forced to fight for survival. And yet here was this human, telling her he could fight off the Dravek when her entire fleet was on the brink of collapse. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaky. "Dant Voss," he answered, his gaze shifting toward the viewport as a series of explosions rocked the ship. "I'm a Terran, and right now, I'm your best chance." Tilara stared at him. Terrans. She had always thought of them as just ancient myths. Terran warriors. She had read about them in her childhood, but those were just stories. Tales of humans who had once fought wars across the stars. But Dante was no myth. He was standing right in front of her, ready to fight off an entire fleet of Dravak warriors. She found it difficult to believe, but the calm confidence in his demeanor made her doubt herself. If anyone could stand against the Dravak, it was this man. Without another word, Dante turned to the controls and started moving swiftly, as though the fate of the ship was already decided. Silara could only watch in awe as he worked with precision, bypassing the damaged systems, restoring power to the weapons and shields, all while the ship was under constant fire from the Dravak. It was as if he had done this 100 times before, and in some ways he had. Silara had never seen anything like it. The ship lurched again as another blast rocked it, and Silara grabbed hold of the nearest support beam. The floor beneath her shook, but Dant didn't flinch. Instead, he simply walked toward the door, his steps steady. "Stay here," he told her without looking back. "I'll be back." Silara wanted to stop him, to ask how he could possibly succeed where so many others had failed, but the words caught in her throat. She realized, deep down, that this wasn't about hope. This was about survival. She had heard the myths of the Terrans, their ability to fight against impossible odds. And now, standing in front of her, Dante Voss was the living embodiment of everything she had once dismissed. As he left, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the ship, and Silara's mind raced. Could he really do it? Could he truly stop the Dravak? In that moment, she realized that whatever he was no mere human. He was a warrior, and perhaps the only one who could save them. Silara couldn't help but stare out the viewport as the ship continued to tremble under the constant barrage of Dravak fire. The sky beyond had become a chaotic whirl of flashing lights, with the very fleet in disarray as it struggled to hold its ground. But inside the shuttle, the chaos was oddly calm, almost as if Dante's presence had silenced the storm outside. She had never known such fear, but now it was something else entirely. There was something strangely comforting about his confidence, even in the face of certain destruction. The door to the cockpit slid open, and Silara's breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Dante, alive, but covered in the telltale signs of battle. His armor was scratched and scorched, his face smeared with dirt and ash. But his eyes were as sharp and clear as ever, a reflection of someone who had faced death countless times and always emerged victorious. Without a word, he crossed the room, his movements fluid and precise, as though he was fully aware that time was slipping away. "We need to go," Dant said, his voice low and steady, unaffected by the chaos outside. "The Dravak are regrouping, and they'll be coming for us next. But if we move fast, we can slip away before they realize what happened." Silara's heart raced. She knew the Dravak weren't just brutal, they were cunning, and if Dant had already fought his way through their forces once, he was likely their top target now. But she couldn't show fear. Not now. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. "There's a hidden moon not far from here," Dant replied. his fingers dancing over the controls, entering coordinates into the navigation system. "It's off the Dravak's radar. We'll be safe there, at least for a while. The very ships won't last much longer. They need time to regroup, and we can't afford to wait around for the Dravak to catch up." Lara nodded, her mind racing. She knew that staying put wasn't an option. The Dravak were ruthless, but the Veri were not equipped to win this fight. Not without help, and certainly not without someone like Dante. She had read the old myths about the Terran warriors, but now she realized there was no myth about him. He was a warrior. He had already fought for his life, and now he was fighting for hers. As the ship veered into the blackness of space, Dante took the controls with the calm efficiency of someone who had flown through countless battles. His eyes were locked onto the instruments, but Lara could see the determination in his expression, his jaw set in a tight line. He wasn't just running, he was leading, and she could sense that he was preparing for whatever might come next. Lara turned her attention to the view screen, watching the Dravak warships follow them. It was clear they weren't letting up. A deep dread filled her chest as she imagined the destruction that would follow if they didn't manage to escape. Her mind raced with questions. How had Dante survived this long? What was it that made him so different, so invincible? But she didn't ask. Not yet. She needed answers, yes, but for now she needed to focus on surviving. She watched him carefully, noticing the way he seemed to always be 5 steps ahead of everyone around him. There was no panic, no uncertainty in his movements. He wasn't just a soldier, he was the embodiment of survival itself. She realized that he was the only thing standing between her people and complete annihilation. "You're sure this will work?" Lara asked, breaking the silence. Dante's lips curled into a brief, grim smile. "I'm sure, but we need to keep moving. I don't plan on dying today." As the shuttle shot deeper into the darkness of space, Lara found herself clinging to that single, simple promise. She had seen the terror in the eyes of her people as they fought for their lives. But now, she felt something else, a glimmer of hope. Dante had given her something her people had lost long ago, belief that even in the face of impossible odds, victory was still within reach. And that was something no myth could ever offer. The shuttle tore through the void of space, weaving between asteroid fields and clouds of debris, trying to stay one step ahead of the relentless Dravak pursuit. Lara's grip tightened on the seat as the ship shuddered from another near miss. Every few seconds, an explosion rippled through the space around them as the Dravak warships launched yet another barrage of fire, trying to lock onto them. Dante's hands moved like lightning over the controls, his face focused, but not a flicker of panic crossed his features. It was as if he had done this 1,000 times, and the danger of the moment was just another part of the mission. Lara couldn't help but marvel at him. The way he stayed calm under pressure was something she had never seen before, especially in the midst of such chaos. There was no panic, no uncertainty, just raw confidence. The Terran warrior stories she had grown up hearing were all starting to make sense. This was the type of fighter they had spoken of, someone who could face the impossible without flinching. "How much longer?" Lara asked, her voice tight with worry as another blast rocked the shuttle. The view of the Dravak fleet on the scanners grew larger by the second, and she knew they didn't have much time left. She had been raised to believe that peace was the answer to all things. But this was survival, pure and simple. And with every passing moment, she realized how far her world had fallen from the safety of diplomacy. Dante's eyes flicked to the sensor screen, then back to the ship's controls. "Just a few more minutes," he said, his voice steady. "We're almost there. Hold on." Lara nodded, but couldn't keep her eyes from darting toward the viewport again. The Dravak ships were getting closer. It was a chilling sight, knowing how ruthless the Dravak were. She had heard stories of their conquests, how they left entire civilizations in ruins. But now she wasn't just hearing the stories, she was living them. As they maneuvered through another asteroid cluster, Lara's thoughts flashed to her people. The Vari had always been peaceful, never needing to fight for their survival. They had thrived in their own way, focusing on knowledge, culture, and exploration. But now, their very existence was threatened. She had seen the fear in the eyes of her people when the Dravak arrived, and she had felt it herself. The reality of war had come to them, and Silara couldn't shake the feeling that if Dant wasn't here, they would already be lost. He was the only reason they were still alive. Another violent shake sent her flying forward, but she caught herself before she could crash into the control panel. "Dante," she gasped, fear rising in her chest. The shuttle was losing power. The Dravak had hit something critical. Dant didn't respond right away. His eyes locked on the control panel as his hands worked with incredible precision. "Just a little more," he muttered under his breath. "Come on." Silara held her breath, watching him, unable to help the sense of dread building inside her. Every instinct told her they were too far outgunned. The Dravak were closing in, and the shuttle wasn't built to withstand much more. She opened her mouth to speak again, but stopped short as Dante slammed his fist down on the console. A burst of energy surged through the ship, and the shuttle jolted forward, faster than Silara thought possible. The Dravak were nearly upon them, and for a moment, Silara thought this was the end. But then, just as the first enemy ship loomed large on the view screen, Dante made a sharp turn, slipping the shuttle into a narrow gap between two massive asteroids. The Dravak ships followed, but they were too large, too slow. The shuttle darted ahead, just out of their reach. Silara's heart pounded in her chest as the tension between them and the Dravak fleet grew. The escape was far from guaranteed, but they had a chance, thanks to Dante. He wasn't just a myth anymore. He was a living legend, and he had just given them a shot at survival. "Hang tight," Dant said, his voice still calm. "We're almost there." Silara couldn't stop herself from exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in hours, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. The shuttle raced through the asteroid field, its engine straining under the pressure. Every turn Dant made was calculated, every move a step ahead of the relentless Dravak pursuit. Silara clung to her seat, her knuckles white, heart pounding in her chest. She had never known fear like this, yet somehow, with Dant at the helm, she also felt a strange sense of calm. His focus was unshakable, his hands moving with expert precision over the controls. It was as if he wasn't just flying the ship, but controlling the very space around them. "Hold on tight," Dant's voice came over the comms, his tone cool as ever. "We're almost clear of them." Silara's breath hitched as the shuttle made another sharp turn, narrowly avoiding a collision with a large asteroid. The Dravak fleet, though faster, was struggling to keep up with the small, nimble ship. Silara glanced at the readouts on the control panel. Though their shields were holding, the energy reserves were dangerously low. They couldn't keep this up much longer. "How much further?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Dant didn't look at her, his attention fixed on the asteroid field ahead. "Not long now. There's a hidden moon on the far side. We'll be safe there." Silara nodded, trying to trust him, but the weight of their situation pressed down on her chest. The Dravak ships were getting closer, and the shuttle was already damaged. Every time they took another hit, the ship groaned as if it might fall apart. She could feel the pull of dread trying to rise, but she pushed it back. There had to be a way out of this. She refused to believe they'd come this far only to be destroyed. Another blast rocked the shuttle, and Silara's vision blurred for a second. She could hear the crew scrambling in the back, trying to stabilize the ship. The constant shaking was starting to feel like an endless barrage. Then, just as quickly as the impact came, it was gone. The ship was moving smoothly again. Dant had done it again. He had avoided another direct hit. Silara's heart raced with a mix of fear and awe. "Dant," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "How do you do it? How are you so calm?" Dant glanced over at her then, his face unreadable. For a moment, There was silence as he flew the shuttle through another narrow gap between asteroids. He looked like he was in complete control of everything. And yet Silara couldn't help but wonder what went on behind his calm exterior. What kind of man could do this, time and time again, without breaking? Survival, Dant finally replied, his voice low but steady. It's all about survival. I've been in worse situations than this, Princess, and I've always made it out. You have to keep moving, keep fighting, even when everything's against you. If you don't, you'll lose. And that's not something I do. His words hit her harder than she expected. She had been raised to believe in peace, in diplomacy, but now she understood what he meant. When everything falls apart, when peace is no longer an option, you have to fight. You have to survive. The Dravak weren't here to negotiate. They were here to destroy. And Silara knew that if she was to protect her people, she had to be willing to do whatever it took. The shuttle shook again, but this time, it wasn't from enemy fire. They had reached the edge of the asteroid field, and ahead of them lay the dark expanse of space. Dante pulled the shuttle up sharply, aiming for the small moon that was just within range. Silara could see it now, a small, desolate rock in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was their best chance. "Get ready," Dante said, his voice now more urgent. "We're making the jump. Once we're on the moon, we'll have a moment to breathe, but not much more. The Dravak won't stop looking for us." Silara's heart raced as they approached the moon's surface. The shuttle's engines roared in protest, but Dante kept them steady, his focus unwavering. As they descended, she couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They were still alive. And for now, that was enough. The shuttle's landing gear touched down with a heavy thud, and Silara let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. They had made it, at least for the moment. But she knew this was just the beginning. The Dravak would find them eventually. The question was when. And would they be ready when the time came? The shuttle's engines hummed softly as it settled onto the barren surface of the moon. The dust around them stirred in the wake of their landing, creating a cloud that quickly dissipated into the cold emptiness of space. Silara's heart was still pounding from the escape, but for the first time in what felt like days, she could breathe a little easier. They were safe, for now. She looked out the viewport at the gray, desolate landscape outside. The moon was lifeless, its surface marked with craters and jagged rocks. There was no sign of life here, no vegetation or civilization. It was the perfect place to hide. But Silara knew that wouldn't last long. The Dravak would find them. They always did. Dante powered down the shuttle systems with practiced efficiency. His every movement was precise, deliberate. He didn't look tired, despite the strain of the past hours. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the surroundings, as though anticipating an attack at any moment. Silara couldn't help but wonder how long he'd been living like this, always on the edge, always prepared for battle. Was it the Terran way? Was survival just second nature to him? "We're safe here for a while," Dante said, as if reading her mind. His voice was low, calm, and it had a steadiness to it that Silara found oddly reassuring. "The Dravak won't expect us to come here, but we won't stay long. We need to make repairs and gather supplies. We're not out of the woods yet." Silara nodded, trying to steady her thoughts. She had seen the destruction the Dravak could bring, and she knew they weren't the type to give up easily. If anything, this brief respite was just that, brief. She looked back at Dante, his focus still fixed on the shuttle systems. There was no trace of hesitation in him, no second-guessing. He was a man on a mission, and she had no doubt he would see it through. "Do you think they'll follow us here?" Silara asked, her voice quiet but filled with concern. Dante finally turned his gaze toward her, his eyes steady, unblinking. "They will," he said simply, "but we'll be ready. I've fought off bigger fleets than theirs. The key is not to give them time to regroup. We make our move before they do." Silara couldn't deny the confidence in his words. It wasn't arrogance. It was a quiet certainty. She had heard stories of Terran warriors, of their fierce independence and their ability to outlast even the most daunting enemies. But now, seeing Dante in action, she understood why. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a strategist. He knew when to strike and when to wait. It wasn't luck that had kept him alive. It was skill, experience, and an unshakable resolve. "We'll need to scavenge what we can from the shuttle," Dante continued, breaking her thoughts. "Food, tools, anything that will help us survive here. We'll need to fortify the shuttle before we start making repairs. The Dravak won't just sit back and let us escape. They'll be looking for us." Silara nodded again, her mind already racing with the steps she needed to take. This was a new world for her, one of survival, not diplomacy. But she had seen enough to know that the fate of her people rested on their ability to keep moving, to keep fighting. If they didn't, they would be wiped out. And she wasn't ready to give up yet. As Dante moved toward the shuttle's storage compartment, Silara took a deep breath, grounding herself. The weight of leadership felt heavier now, but it was a burden she was willing to bear. She had always been a princess, sheltered from the harsh realities of war. But now, with the Dravak at their doorstep, she was learning quickly that the only thing that mattered was survival. They didn't have much time. She knew that. But as she watched Dante begin preparing the shuttle for whatever came next, a small spark of hope flared within her. They had made it this far. And with him by her side, maybe, just maybe, they could make it even further. The silence of the moon was unsettling. The only sound inside the shuttle was the quiet hum of the life support systems and the occasional crackle of static as Dante worked on the repairs. Silara stood at the entrance of the shuttle, her eyes scanning the barren landscape outside. The dust from their landing had settled, leaving behind a quiet calm, but she knew it wouldn't last long. The Dravak were ruthless hunters, and they wouldn't stop until they had wiped out every last one of her people. She had seen what they were capable of, and there was no way they would let her escape without a fight. Inside the shuttle, Dante was already knee-deep in work. He moved with a calm precision, repairing the damaged systems with ease. His hands were steady, his focus unbroken. Silara had never seen anyone so dedicated to their craft. She watched him for a moment before shaking herself out of her thoughts. She couldn't afford to be distracted. Not now. "What's the situation?" she asked, stepping closer. Dante didn't look up from his work, but his voice was steady. "The shields are down, and the propulsion system took a hit. It's going to take some time to get everything back up and running. We'll need to patch up the hull, too. We're exposed here, and the longer we stay, the more likely it is the Dravak will find us." Silara's heart sank. They were stranded on a barren moon, with limited resources and a damaged shuttle. It wasn't exactly the best odds for survival. She glanced at the control panel, her mind racing. "How long do we have?" Dante paused for a moment, his brow furrowing as he considered the question. "If we're lucky, a few days. But it won't be easy. We'll need to scavenge and make repairs with whatever we have left. I've fought in worse conditions, though. We just need to keep our heads and stay one step ahead." Silara watched him, her admiration growing. She had always been the diplomat, the one who negotiated and found peaceful solutions. But she was beginning to see that this, survival, was a different kind of skill. And Dante had it in spades. His confidence, his resilience, it was a lifeline. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a strategist, and that was something she could learn from. "Tell me what you need," she said, her voice firm. "I'll help however I can." Dante glanced up at her, his eyes steady. "We'll need to fortify the shuttle. There's a rocky outcrop nearby we can use for cover. If we can get there, we can set up a temporary shelter. We'll have to be quick, though. The Dravak could be tracking our last position." Silara nodded, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on her. But this time, she didn't hesitate. She had seen Dante's leadership, his ability to stay calm under pressure. It had given her confidence in their chances. They weren't helpless. Together, they could survive. She wasn't just the princess of a peaceful people anymore. She was a survivor, and she would do whatever it took to keep her people safe. They gathered what supplies they had and set out toward the outcrop Dante had mentioned. The harsh winds of the moon whipped around them as they trekked across the barren landscape, the rocky ground crunching beneath their boots. Silara's mind raced with the urgency of the moment. Every step felt like it could be their last, but Dante moved with steady purpose, his eyes always scanning the horizon, alert for any signs of danger. As they reached the rocky shelter, Dante gave a quick nod of approval. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The outcrop provided them with some cover, and they quickly set up a perimeter. As they worked, Silara couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They were alive. They were still fighting, and with Dante by her side, she knew they had a chance. The sky above the rocky outcrop was an endless void, black and empty, as if the universe itself had forgotten the moon beneath it. The wind howled, kicking up small clouds of dust that swirled around them. But inside their makeshift shelter, Silara and Dante worked tirelessly. The shuttle had been partially repaired, but there was still much to be done. The shields were up again, but they were fragile, and the propulsion system was still temperamental. They couldn't risk staying here much longer. The Dravak would eventually track them down, and this fragile safety they'd found would crumble. Silara's hands trembled as she checked the shuttle's energy levels. She hated this feeling, being helpless, depending on Dante's expertise to keep them alive. Back on her homeworld, she had been a leader, a symbol of hope. Now she was just another person, struggling to survive. But as she looked over at Dante, working tirelessly with an unyielding focus, she realized how far she had come. She wasn't helpless. She was learning to fight, to think like a survivor, and most importantly, to trust in the man beside her. Dante had become more than just a myth to her. He was a hero, someone whose strength and determination had given her the will to keep going, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Are we ready to move?" Silara asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Dante looked up from his work, wiping sweat from his brow. He had barely slept in days, and yet his eyes were still sharp, focused. "Almost. We've got enough power to make a short jump, but we'll need to keep our course hidden. The Dravak will be looking for us, and if we're not careful, they'll catch us before we even have a chance to escape." Silara nodded, taking in the gravity of his words. She didn't want to think about what would happen if they were caught. The Dravak had already shown their cruelty, their ruthlessness. She couldn't let that happen to her people. "Then let's do it," she said, her voice firmer than before. "We can't wait any longer." Dante gave her a brief smile, a rare sight. He appreciated her determination. "You're right. We move out in an hour. Get everything packed. We'll need to be quick." The next hour felt like an eternity. Silara double-checked their supplies, water, food rations, and a few tools that might help them along the way. She had learned quickly that survival in space wasn't just about having the right weapons or the right equipment. It was about being resourceful, using what you had to its fullest potential. And Dante was a master of that. Finally, with everything packed and ready to go, they boarded the shuttle once more. Silara took a deep breath as she strapped herself into her seat. She glanced over at Dante, who was already at the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons. There was no hesitation in him, no doubt. He was ready. He was always ready. As the shuttle's engines roared to life, Silara felt a strange calm wash over her. They had made it this far. They had survived. And with Dante at her side, she believed they could survive a little longer. The shuttle lifted off the rocky surface, leaving behind the shelter that had protected them for so long. The stars beyond twinkled coldly, offering no answers, only an endless expanse of uncertainty. But Silara knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the same woman who had landed on this moon. She had seen the darkest corners of war, and she had learned what it took to survive. And with the Terran warrior beside her, they were ready to face whatever came next. As they shot into the unknown, Silara didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot.